In the frozen and unforgiving plains of rural America, where winter arrives like a silent predator and loneliness is the only constant companion, there exist stories that defy human comprehension. This is one of them. Harold Jennings was a 67-year-old farmer who had lived most of his life alone on an isolated rural property in Montana. After the death of his wife Margaret and the departure of his only son to the big city, Harold became what the nearest neighbors, who lived 15 kilometers away, called the Lone Farmer. But on a January morning, when the temperature plummeted to minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit and the snow covered everything like a blanket of death, Harold found something that would forever change his definition of love, sacrifice, and redemption. A black horse, frozen, motionless like a statue of ice. And what that animal was protecting with its own body, Harold would never forget. This story will make you cry, smile, and above all, believe in the inexplicable power of love, even in creatures that don't speak our language. The wall clock showed 5:17 in the morning when Harold Jennings opened his eyes. Not because of an alarm. He hadn't used one in decades, but because his body was programmed to wake before the sun, like every self-respecting farmer. The bedroom was freezing, despite the wood-burning heater. He had fed at 3 in the morning. The winter of 2023 was being particularly cruel, even by Montana standards. Harold sat up in bed with a groan. His joints protested like rusty hinges, a symphony of cracks and pains that had become his morning soundtrack in recent years. At 67, he was still strong. Years of manual labor had sculpted muscles that refused to completely disappear. But age collected its toll from everyone without exception. He looked at the empty side of the bed. Margaret's pillow was still there, untouched for 3 years. He never had the courage to remove it. Sometimes on the coldest nights, he would reach out and touch the fabric, imagining he could still feel her warmth there. "Good morning, Maggie," he murmured, as he did every morning since the funeral. He didn't expect an answer, of course, but talking to her made the house feel less empty, less silent. Harold put on 3 layers of clothing: thermal undershirt, flannel shirt, wool sweater knitted by Margaret herself years ago, and descended the creaking stairs to the kitchen. The house was a century-old construction, built by Harold's grandfather in 1920, when the Jennings family arrived from Nebraska with dreams of prospering on Montana's fertile lands. 3 generations had been born, lived, and died in that house. And now, Harold was the last. His son, Thomas, lived in Seattle. He worked with computers, something Harold never fully understood. Thomas called once a month, sometimes less, always in a hurry, always promising to visit soon, a soon that never came. Harold didn't blame him. Modern life had no room for old farms and stubborn fathers who refused to abandon unproductive land. While preparing coffee, strong and bitter, as always, Harold looked through the kitchen window. The landscape was a white and infinite ocean. The snow had fallen uninterruptedly for 4 days, and now covered everything with more than 3 feet of thickness. The red barn, which stood about 50 meters from the house, looked like a lonely island in a frozen sea. The surrounding trees were bent under the weight of ice, their bare branches pointing to the gray sky like skeletal fingers begging for mercy. The radio on the kitchen counter crackled with static before transmitting the local presenter's voice. Temperatures are expected to remain below minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit for the next 3 days. Authorities recommend that residents of rural areas stay home and regularly check livestock and equipment, for deaths from hypothermia have already been recorded in the county since. Harold turned off the radio. He didn't need anyone telling him the obvious. He had survived worse winters than this one, or at least that's what he told himself. After coffee, he put on his heavy coat, a leather piece lined with sheepskin that had belonged to his father, pulled on waterproof boots, and put on his wool hat. The ritual of dressing to face the cold took almost 10 minutes, each layer armor against the invisible enemy that waited outside. He had 3 horses in the barn: Duke, a 15-year-old chestnut; Bella, a 12-year-old painted mare; and an old pony named Chester that Margaret had rescued from a slaughterhouse over a decade ago. All 3 needed to be fed, the water checked to ensure it hadn't frozen, in the heated troughs. Harold opened the back door, and the cold hit him like a punch to the face. The air was so frigid that it hurt to breathe, each breath a burn in his lungs. He lowered the scarf over his nose and began walking toward the barn, his feet sinking into the snow almost at his knees. That's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was an illusion, a mirage caused by the blinding glare of the rising sun on the snow. But the more he looked, the more certain he was that there was something there by the fence of the north pasture, a fence he hadn't visited in weeks, since the snow had blocked the path. A dark shape, large, motionless. Harold's heart raced. His horses were in the barn, he was sure. He had locked them there the night before, as he always did during storms. So what was that? He changed direction, abandoning the path to the barn, and beginning to forge a new route through the deep snow. Each step was a monumental effort, his thighs burning with the physical demand. He was no longer young, no longer as strong as before. But something about that dark shape called him, pulled him like an invisible magnet. It took almost 15 minutes to cover the 100 meters that separated him from the fence. When he finally got close enough to see clearly, Harold stopped. His heart, already beating fast from the effort, now seemed to have frozen along with everything around him. It was a horse, black as the darkest night, lying on its side in the snow, its body a stain of darkness against the infinite white, and it wasn't moving. Harold stood frozen for a long moment, his breath forming clouds of vapor that quickly dissipated in the freezing air. The black horse lay motionless, its dark coat partially covered by a thin layer of fresh snow that had fallen during the night. There were no signs of movement, no trembling, no visible breathing, no vapor coming from its nostrils. Good Lord, Harold muttered to himself, taking the final steps to reach the animal. Up close, he could see it was a stallion, a magnificent specimen despite its current condition. The horse was large, probably measuring over 17 hands, with musculature that suggested strength and speed. Its coat was such a deep black that it seemed to absorb the light around it, without a single white marking, something rare in horses of this color. Harold knelt in the snow, ignoring the cold that immediately began to penetrate through his pants. He extended his gloved hand and touched the animal's neck, searching for any sign of warmth, any indication of life. The skin was cold, terribly cold. "Where did you come from, boy?" Harold asked in a low voice, even knowing there would be no answer. There were no nearby farms that had black horses. Harold knew all the neighbors and their animals. The closest property was the Morrisons, 15 kilometers to the south, and they only raised cattle. The Pattersons to the east had some horses, but they were all light-colored, Palominos and Pintos, if you remember correctly. This horse was a stranger, an outsider who, somehow, had found his way to the Jennings property in the middle of one of the worst snowstorms in decades. Harold moved his hand along the side of the animal's body, checking for visible injuries. That's when he noticed something strange. The horse was positioned in a peculiar way. Its body curved around something, as if protecting something with its own body. The old farmer frowned. With effort, he stood up and walked around the horse to see what was on the other side. What he saw made his heart stop. There, nestled against the black horse's chest, in a small space protected from the wind and snow by the animal's massive body, was a foal, a tiny baby, no more than a few weeks old, with a silver-gray coat that seemed to glow even in the pale morning light. The little one was curled up on itself, its thin legs folded under its body, its head resting on its front hooves. And it was trembling, alive. The foal was alive. Harold felt tears burn his eyes before he even realized he was crying. The cold froze him almost instantly on his cheeks, but he didn't care. Before him was something he had seen only once in his entire life as a farmer, and even then, never under circumstances like these. The black horse had sacrificed its own life to protect the foal from the deadly cold. It was what Mares did for their foals. Harold knew. But this was a stallion, a male. Males rarely displayed this type of protective behavior. And yet, there was the proof before his eyes. The black horse had lain down in the snow, using its body as a shield against the wind and lethal temperature, transferring its body heat to the small foal until there was nothing left to give. Harold acted on instinct. He removed his coat, his father's coat, the warmest piece he owned, and carefully wrapped the trembling foal in it. The baby was incredibly light, weighing no more than a large dog. Its eyes, a surprisingly clear blue, opened briefly and looked at Harold with an expression that the old farmer could only describe as gratitude. "It's going to be all right, little one," Harold said. His voice choked. "I'm going to take care of you. I promise." He stood up with the foal in his arms, feeling the cold bite his now unprotected skin through his flannel shirt. It didn't matter. He would have time to warm up later. What mattered now was saving that small life which, against all odds, had survived the coldest night of the year. But before leaving, Harold looked one last time at the black horse motionless in the snow. A wave of emotion washed over him. Respect, sadness, admiration. That animal had done something extraordinary. Something that many humans would be incapable of doing. "Thank you," Harold said to the fallen horse. "I don't know where you came from, boy, but you're a hero, and I'm going to make sure she knows it. Every day of her life, she will know what you did for her." With the foal safe in his arms, Harold began the long and arduous journey back to the house. Each step was a struggle against the deep snow and the penetrating cold, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, because for the first time in 3 years, since Margaret had departed, Harold Jennings had a purpose again, and he wasn't going to fail. The walk back to the house seemed to last an eternity. 100 meters transformed into a marathon when each step required Harold to lift his legs above the knee-deep snow, all while carrying the foal wrapped in his coat. The cold cut through his flannel shirt as if it didn't exist, but Harold barely noticed. His attention was completely focused on the small trembling body in his arms. When he finally reached the back door and entered the kitchen, the warmth of the house hit him like a blessing. He almost wept with relief. First things first, Harold said to himself, his farmer's mind switching into survival mode. He carried the foal to the living room, where the fireplace still burned with embers from a night before. With quick and precise movements, despite his fingers numbed by the cold, Harold added more wood to the fire and blew until the flames came back to life. Within minutes, heat began to radiate through the room. Harold placed the foal on the rug in front of the fireplace, still wrapped in the coat. Now, under proper light and away from the blinding glare of the snow, he could examine the baby more closely. The foal was a filly, he realized. Her silver-gray coat was lighter than it had appeared outside, almost white in some places, with darker patches on her legs and around her muzzle. She was terribly thin, her ribs visible under the skin, her hips protruding. It was clear she hadn't fed properly in days, maybe longer, but she was alive, breathing, and when Harold touched her forehead, he felt a warmth that was faint but present. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he said softly, stroking the filly's thin neck. "Like your father. Or was it your mother who was a fighter? Well, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here." Harold knew the next few minutes would be critical. Hypothermia in young animals was frequently fatal, even when they appear to be recovering. He needed to warm the filly gradually. Too much heat too quickly could be just as dangerous as the cold she had endured. He went to the hallway closet and grabbed every blanket and comforter he could find. Some were old, worn by time and use. Others were relics of Margaret. Crochet blankets she had made during the long winters, each one with intricate patterns and vibrant colors. Harold carefully stacked them around and over the filly, creating a cocoon of warmth. Next, he went to the kitchen to prepare something his grandmother used to make for newborn animals in distress, a mixture of warm water with a little sugar and a pinch of salt. It wasn't milk. He didn't have mare's milk, and pure cow's milk might be too heavy for the filly's weakened stomach, but it would provide some energy and hydration. When he returned with the mixture in a baby bottle he had found at the bottom of a cabinet, a relic from the days when Thomas was a baby, the filly had opened her eyes. She watched him with those extraordinary blue eyes, and Harold felt something tighten in his chest. "Here, little one," he said, kneeling beside her and offering the bottle. "I know you prefer real milk, but this will have to do for now." The filly hesitated for a moment, her eyes going from the bottle to Harold's face and back. Then, as if she had made a decision, she stretched her neck and began sucking on the bottle's nipple. Harold let out a sigh of relief. If she was willing to feed, her chances of survival increased dramatically. As the filly drank, slowly, with frequent pauses, but consistently, Harold let his mind wander to the black horse he had left behind in the snow. Who was he? Where had he come from? And how had he arrived there? in the middle of a snowstorm with such a young foal? The questions had no easy answers. Harold knew the region like the back of his hand, and there were no farms or stables within at least a 12-mile radius that could have lost a horse like that. And even if there were, no animal would survive a journey like that in the middle of a blizzard, unless— Harold frowned, an old memory trying to form in his mind. There were stories, legends really, about wild horses that still roamed the most remote regions of Montana. Small groups, descendants of animals that had escaped from farms decades or even centuries ago, that kept away from humans and lived in freedom in the unexplored mountains and plains. Was it possible? Was the Black Horse one of these wild horses? And if so, what had led him to seek refuge on the Jennings property? The filly finished drinking and let her head fall onto the rug, exhausted by the effort. Her eyes closed, her breathing becoming deeper and more regular. Harold watched her sleep, the fire crackling softly beside them. "You're going to need a name," he said quietly. "Every warrior needs a name." He thought for a moment, looking at the silver coat that gleamed in the light of the flames. "Hope," he finally decided. "I'm going to call you Hope." The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster for Harold. Hope, as he had named the filly, oscillated between moments of encouraging improvement and frightening episodes of weakness that made the old farmer fear the worst. But every morning, when he descended the stairs and found those bright blue eyes watching him from the rug in front of the fireplace, he felt a wave of relief and gratitude he couldn't fully explain. On the third day after finding Hope, Harold finally gathered the courage to do something he had postponed. Return to where the Black Horse lay and examine him more closely. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of crystalline white under a mercilessly clear blue sky. The temperature was still brutal, but the wind had ceased, making the journey less torturous. He left Hope sleeping in her nest of blankets, with the fire well fed, and set out for the north pasture. The Black Horse's body was exactly where he had left it, now covered by a thicker layer of snow. Harold brushed it away gently, revealing once again that dark and impressive coat. With clear daylight and without the urgency of saving the filly, he could examine the animal more closely. The stallion had no visible injuries, no cuts, no marks from predator attacks. His body seemed to have simply given in to the cold and exhaustion. Around his neck, Harold found something that made his heart tighten. Old scars, poorly healed, the kind that remain when an animal wore a rope or halter too tight for too long. "You escaped from somewhere, didn't you?" Harold said to the motionless horse. "Someone treated you badly, and when you got your freedom, you never looked back." But there was something more, something Harold almost missed, but that caught his attention when a ray of sunlight hit the right angle. On the horse's left shoulder, partially covered by the long winter coat, was a mark, a brand. Harold carefully parted the hair and studied the symbol. It was an old mark, faded by time but still legible, a circle with 3 lines crossing through it. A mark he knew, a mark that made his heart nearly stop. It was the brand of Thornwood Farm. Harold straightened abruptly, his mind spinning. Thornwood Farm hadn't existed for at least 15 years. It was located on the other side of the mountains, more than 50 miles away. Its owner, a man named Victor Thornwood, had been arrested for animal abuse after authorities discovered the deplorable conditions in which he kept his cattle and horses. The farm was closed, the animals seized and redistributed. But not all the animals were recovered. Harold now remembered. There were rumors that some horses had escaped during the confusion of the seizure, fleeing to the mountains and never being seen again. 15 years. The Black Horse had lived free in the mountains for 15 years, surviving brutal winters and scorching summers, avoiding predators and hunters, living a life that was probably fuller and freer than anything he would have experienced under Victor Thornwood's cruel care. And at some point during those 15 years, he had found a mate. They had a foal. And when the most severe storm in decades threatened the life of his offspring, the old stallion did the only thing he could do. He guided the filly to the nearest place of civilization he knew and gave his life to keep her warm until help arrived. Harold sat in the snow beside the horse, not caring about the cold penetrating his clothes. Tears ran down his face, freezing before they reached his chin. He thought of Margaret. He thought of how she had spent her final months fighting a cancer that should never have touched her, a woman so full of life and kindness. He thought of how she had worried about him until the end, making him promise that he would keep living, that he would find a purpose, that he wouldn't let loneliness consume him. "I think I finally understand, Maggie," Harold said out loud, looking at the blue sky. "Sometimes life sends us messages in ways we never expect. Sometimes hope comes with four legs and blue eyes and a story that breaks our heart, but also reminds us why it's worth continuing." He stayed there for a while longer, keeping company with the black horse that had given everything for his offspring. When he finally stood up, he had already made a decision. "I'm going to bury you properly," Harold promised. "When the ground thaws, in the east pasture, where the morning sun shines and the wildflowers grow in spring, it's the least you deserve." He touched the horse's muzzle one last time. "And I'm going to take care of your daughter. She's going to grow up strong and free. Like you, I promise." With a heavy heart, but strangely at peace, Harold began the long walk back home. The weeks that followed completely transformed Harold Jennings's life. Hope recovered faster than he had dared to expect, her young constitution proving more resilient than her initial condition suggested. In 2 weeks, she was already on her feet, wobbling around the living room on trembling but determined legs. In a month, she was running through the hallway of the house, her small hooves making a strange sound against the wooden floor. Harold knew that keeping a horse inside the house wasn't a permanent solution, but until the temperature rose and he could prepare her to live in the barn with Duke, Bella, and Chester, he saw no other option. And, secretly, he was enjoying the company. The house had changed with Hope's presence. The oppressive silence that Harold had endured for 3 years was replaced by the sound of hooves on the floor, by the soft whinnies the filly made when she saw her caretaker, by the warmth of another living being sharing his space. Harold found himself constantly talking to Hope, not monologues directed at a photo on the wall, but real conversations in which he could almost swear the filly understood him. "You're getting too strong for this room," Harold told her one morning, as she wriggled free from his hands and galloped in circles around the dining table. "But I think you already know that, don't you?" Hope stopped and looked at him, her blue eyes shining with something that looked very much like mischief. Then she approached and pushed her muzzle against the pocket of Harold's coat, the place where he kept pieces of apple as treats. "You're a manipulator," Harold laughed, giving her what she wanted, "just like your grandmother." He found himself making references like that frequently, comparing Hope to Margaret, as if the filly were somehow an extension of his late wife. It was irrational, he knew, but there was something in Hope's spirit, her determination to survive, her ability to find joy in the smallest things, that reminded Harold of the woman he had loved for 40 years. In early March, when temperatures began to rise and the snow began its slow retreat, Harold made a decision that surprised even himself. He called Thomas. The call was answered on the 5th ring, his son's voice sounding hurried and distracted as always. "Dad? Is everything okay? Did something happen?" "Everything's fine, son. I wanted to tell you a story." The silence on the other end of the line was charged with surprise. Harold wasn't one to call without reason, and certainly not one to tell stories. "What story?" And then Harold told him. He told about the storm, about finding the black horse, about Hope. He told about the weeks of care, about how the filly had transformed his routine, about how he had rediscovered a purpose he thought he had lost forever. Thomas listened in silence, and when Harold finished, there was a long pause before his son spoke. "Dad, I'm coming there." Harold blinked, surprised. "What?" "I'm coming there, next weekend. I want to see this filly. And I want—" Thomas's voice wavered. "I want to see you, Dad. It's been too long." Harold felt tears threaten again, but this time he held them back. "That would be good, son. That would be very good." When the call ended, Harold looked at Hope, who had lain down on a rug in front of the fireplace, her favorite spot, even now that she no longer needed the warmth to survive. "Did you hear that?" he said to her. "Thomas is coming. You're finally going to meet my son." Hope raised her head and whinnied softly, as if she understood the importance of the moment. That weekend, when Thomas got out of the rental car and saw his father for the first time in 2 years, he was struck by the change. Harold looked younger, somehow more alive, His eyes had a sparkle that Thomas hadn't seen since before his mother's death. "So," Thomas said, after a long and somewhat awkward hug. Neither of them was good at showing physical affection. "Where's this famous filly?" Harold smiled and led him to the barn, where Hope now lived alongside the other horses. She had adapted surprisingly well, quickly establishing her position in the small herd. Chester, the old pony, had become her unofficial protector, always keeping an eye on her like a doting grandfather. When Hope saw Harold, she immediately trotted to the fence, pushing her muzzle against his chest and searching for treats in his pockets. Thomas watched the interaction with moist eyes. "She's beautiful, Dad." "Yes, she is," Harold agreed. "She's the reason I'm still here." It was a heavy confession, said casually, but Thomas understood the weight behind the words. He put his hand on his father's shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I should have." "You're here now," Harold interrupted. "That's what matters." Father and son stood in silence for a moment, watching Hope play with the other horses in the pasture, her silver coat gleaming under the March sun. 3 years had passed since that frozen morning, when Harold Jennings found a black horse protecting a filly. 3 years of changes the old farmer could never have predicted. Hope had become a magnificent mare, as impressive as her father had been. Her silver coat had darkened with age, now closer to stormy gray. But her eyes maintained that extraordinary blue that Harold had first noticed when she was just a trembling baby. She was tall for a mare, almost as tall as the black stallion had been, and carried within her the same combination of strength and grace that her father had demonstrated even in his final moments. But the biggest change wasn't in Hope. It was in Harold. The lone farmer was no longer lonely. Thomas came to visit once a month, sometimes bringing his girlfriend Sarah, a kind woman from Seattle who had fallen in love with the farm and the horses on her first visit. The neighbors, who for years had maintained a respectful distance from Harold, now appeared regularly, drawn by the story of hope that had spread through the community. The house that once was silent as a tomb now frequently echoed with conversations, laughter, and the sound of hooves in the pasture. Harold had also done what he promised the black horse. When the ground thawed that first spring, he dug a grave in the east pasture, where the morning sun bathed the land and wildflowers grew in profusion. There, he buried the stallion who had given his life for his offspring, marking the spot with a large stone he had carried from the mountains himself. On the stone, Harold carved a single word: sacrifice. Every year, on the anniversary of the day he found Hope, Harold walked to that stone and spent a moment in silence, remembering the black horse that had changed everything. But the story didn't end there. In the spring of her 3rd year, Hope gave birth to her first foal. It was a colt black as night, so similar to his grandfather that Harold cried when he first saw him. The colt was born strong and healthy, his long legs already stable just hours after birth. Harold named him Shadow, a tribute to Hope's father, whose sacrifice had made all of this possible. And as Harold watched Shadow take his first trembling steps, with Hope standing protectively beside him, just as her father had done for her, he felt Margaret's presence stronger than ever. She was there, he could swear, smiling at that scene of new life and renewed hope. "Did you see that, Maggie?" Harold whispered, tears flowing freely. This is how it works. Life continues. Love continues. Even when we think everything is over. Thomas found his father later that day, sitting on the pasture fence, watching the horses. The son sat beside him, and for a long moment, neither spoke. "Dad," Thomas finally said, "Sarah and I decided something." Harold looked at his son, waiting. "We're going to move here. Sarah can work remotely, and I decided it's time to learn how to be a farmer." Harold was silent for so long that Thomas began to worry. Then the old farmer smiled, a genuine smile, full of joy, that transformed his aged face. "Your mother would love to know that." "I know," Thomas said. "That's why we decided." They sat there, father and son, watching Hope care for Shadow as the sun set over the Montana mountains, painting the sky in pink and gold. Duke, Bella, and Chester grazed peacefully in the distance, and the land that 3 generations of Jennings had worked stretched around them like a blanket of promise and possibility. Harold thought of the black horse, lying alone in the snow, giving his last breath so his daughter could live. He thought of all the sacrifices that people and animals make for those they love, often without recognition or gratitude. He thought of Margaret, who had fought to live longer, not for herself, but have one more day, one more hour, one more moment with him. And he thought of Hope, who had arrived in his life as a frozen miracle and had warmed his heart in ways he never imagined possible. "You know what I learned?" Harold said to Thomas, his voice husky with emotion. "Hope never truly dies. Sometimes it stays hidden, frozen, waiting for the right moment to awaken. But it's always there, if you know where to look." Thomas put his arm around his father's shoulders. "That's a good lesson, Dad." "It's the best one I ever learned," Harold replied. "And it took a black horse and a silver filly to teach me.